Hello, this is our lecture on democracy and the mind. So we just finished thinking about how rights and values conflict, and one of the main things we learned is that values and rights clash often because they are so subjective. That is, what is fair and just in my eyes might not be fair and just in your eyes. So today we're going to look at political psychology, and we're going to make this even more complicated by taking into account how the mind works and how people think about politics differently, and how bringing in this psychological perspective can help us answer a lot of questions, but also raises a number of new questions and a lot of problems for democratic governance. We're going to focus on two broad themes. First, are Homo sapiens cut out to be good democratic citizens? To make democracy work, the citizens have to do certain things. After all, it is rule by the people, so they need to be fit to rule. This is a long line of thought, and Plato and many others questioned the ability of a large group of people to rule justly. For Plato, the answer was philosopher kings. Of course, that's pretty out of date now, and arguments against democracy have largely lost their credibility. Democracy is, as we've seen, a universal value, or something desired by almost everyone. However, for Plato, the problem was not that democracy was undesirable. For him, it was the most desirable ideal of government. He just said in practice, it would not work. In a perfect world with all thoughtful, reasonable citizens, democracy would indeed be the best. The problem is finding a polity with all thoughtful, reasonable citizens. Indeed, the framers of the U.S. Constitution were very cognizant of this problem, and thus built a republic with many checks on the popular will in order to avoid mob rule. The second matter we'll take up is, why do people disagree so vehemently about politics? How can people see the world so differently? Maybe you've had the experience that someone you think of as completely reasonable says something about politics or society that you can't believe anyone could actually think. Then there is the old rule of leaving politics and religion out of discussion, mainly because people get so worked up about them. Indeed, political discussions can turn into senseless shouting matches really quickly, and in these shouting matches both sides feel misunderstood and as if the other side just won't listen to them. In the second part of this section, we're going to look at work that helps us understand how people can come to such remarkably different conclusions about politics, and how our brains have mechanisms in place to perpetuate these misunderstandings and turn them into full-fledged holy wars. So let's get started. What does democracy demand of the people? The Founding Fathers thought that we, the people, need to understand enough about politics to participate in political debates and choose among political alternatives competently. That is, we need to choose who is going to be our leader. We also need to be able to hold those elected officials accountable. Finally, we might even need from time to time to pick a side on a specific law in a referendum. So we might have to pass judgment on specific policies. So we've seen some of these take place in states like Colorado and Washington with legalization of marijuana, and many other states with legalization of same-sex marriage. So sometimes the citizens will actually be asked to make a specific policy judgment. To do all of this, however, people need to have a basic level of political information and a grasp of both the facts of the basic political issues and a reasonable understanding of how their political system actually works. Unfortunately, the level of political knowledge among members of the public is typically quite low, as is overall interest in politics. One of the most classic studies of political behavior was carried out by a man named Philip Converse. He looked at surveys given to the same people repeatedly over time, and he analyzed if these same people answered the same questions about political preferences and issues. He found that the vast majority of respondents answered as if randomly. That is, their responses actually changed a lot over time to the same questions. There was no discernible pattern in their issue positions to the same questions, which led him to question whether there is even a public will to represent. Anybody who has ever seen Jay Leno's segment, Jaywalking, in which he asks random people questions about politics and current events, will understand Converse's point. There are a few standard political knowledge measures, such as identifying the vice president by name. You can see here the results of a 2011 poll asking respondents to name which party is more conservative and to pick a party that is in control of the House of Representatives. This might sound really easy to you, and you might be surprised that only 67% of respondents could pick the Conservative Party. That's pretty bad. I mean, there's only two parties to choose from, so it's not much better than chance. And then we get to how many of the respondents knew that the Republicans were in control of the House at that time, and you go below 50%, which is worse than just guessing by chance. So of course you're college students, and thus you're likely to be much more politically aware than most of the public, but The main point here is that a lot of political information studies show political information among the public to be quite low. Political scientists have tried to reconcile the low level of public knowledge of politics with successful American democracy in many ways. First, some argue that though we are ignorant and irrational on an individual basis, taken all together, we the people are irrational as a group. This works because our individual misconceptions and information gaps cancel out one another and leave a more moderate, rational public in the aggregate. Another more influential take on how individuals can be good citizens without lots of time and effort spent learning all the complicated political topics out there is by using heuristics. Heuristics is a word coming from the same Greek word as eureka, and heuristics means serving to discover or to find. They are information shortcuts that help us make decisions quickly and without every last bit of information. Thus, they are bits of information or cues that we can use to make inferences about what's going on. Let's look at some examples. Here is a man who you may or may not recognize, and judging him, you might not have anything to go off of yet. Let's let your heuristics do some work for you. This is Sherrod Brown, an Ohio senator. He's a Democrat, and indeed, party identification, along with ideology, is one of the key heuristics in politics. I'm sure that as soon as I say he's a Democrat, you have a better sense of how you feel about him, as well as a series of educated guesses about his stances on various policy issues. This is exactly how heuristics work. One piece of information serves as a powerful cue, giving you more information than is actually contained in that original piece. This means that even if you don't spend a ton of time getting to know every last aspect of Sherrod Brown's career and all of his stances, you can make the decision necessary of you just by knowing his political ideology or his party identification. Another heuristic is endorsement. So Bill Clinton comes to your town and endorses Senator Brown. That also gives you a lot of information. Some of the way you feel about President Clinton would transfer to Mr. Brown. Endorsements can also serve as heuristics for certain specific issues. For example, if the NRA or Greenpeace endorses candidates, you can make inferences about those candidates and their positions. This is another way people can learn enough to participate without having all of the information. There are a bunch of different heuristics, ranging from very specific to something as general as likability. Maybe a politician gave a speech that you thought brought up a lot of great points and made you like him more. Maybe you just like to grab a beer or grab lunch with him. There's a lot of evidence that people tend to pick candidates who they just like more. And there's actually a lot of evidence that we tend to like candidates who are more physically attractive. So physically attractive candidates get elected. So attractability could be a heuristic as well. Another possible heuristic is the economy. You might not know how exactly to evaluate whether political leaders are doing a good job governing, but if the economy is roaring, you can use this as a heuristic to figure out that they're doing pretty well, while if the economy is failing, you can kick them out for failing to govern well. This is called retrospective voting. And finally, a lot of other things serve as heuristics as well. These can be things like race, gender, or religion, as people often assume things about other people based upon these criteria. So do these alternatives get us out of the problem of low information? Not really. First, the collective rationality argument doesn't work very well because it assumes that our mistakes cancel each other out. This is a big assumption, and it requires that all of our mistakes are random, which does not allow for systematic bias. In other words, if we are all wrong in random ways, then maybe our mistakes do actually cancel one another out. However, if lots of people are wrong in the same way, that is, if there's some sort of systematic bias in public opinion, if we all hold the same sort of misperceptions in the same direction, then there is no collective rationality. The public is just wrong on something. Heuristics are also very problematic. There is no doubt that they exert a very strong effect upon political behavior and opinion, but that doesn't mean that they are always accurate or desirable. The problem is that these are necessarily oversimplifications. They will guide real information searching, processing, and retention, but they often come from somewhat shallow premises. So I mentioned earlier that just attractiveness can serve as heuristic. We don't necessarily think that our political leaders need to be attractive to govern well, but it's a pretty robust finding that more attractive candidates are more likely to get elected. The concept of heuristics is actually something that political scientists borrowed from psychology. But whereas for political scientists, these heuristics were originally our salvation in fixing low information, in psychology, heuristics have always been seen more as an explanation for bad or mistaken reasoning, for an explanation of bias. Think of it this way. Just because Sherrod Brown is a Democrat does not mean that he holds all of the specific views that we associate with a Democrat, so we are probably getting a lot of the specifics wrong. Indeed, can you think of another word for an assumption we make about someone based upon unrelated information? That's right. You can think of heuristics as stereotypes. Sometimes they'll give you accurate information, but a lot of the time they really won't. So we have the problem of a relatively uninformed public. Unfortunately, we have a few other problems to look into, and these problems connect with the problem of the uninformed public. The first is that we rush to conclusions. We make a lot of snap judgments. That we make snap judgments is partly caused by the fact that a lot of our behavior actually happens without our true conscious knowledge. This is the main argument of a number of prominent books that are pretty popular today, such as those by Malcolm Gladwell. You might have heard of Blink or What the Dog Saw or the new David Goliath book, and another recent book by Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman, which is called Thinking Fast and Slow. You may have heard of these books, you may have read them in class or seen these authors on the news, but a lot of their basic argumentation is about all the crazy subconscious processes going on in our minds all the time, and the surprising ways they direct our thought and our behavior without us even knowing it. If you are interested in psychology at all, I'd really recommend the Kahneman book in particular. It'll make you rethink a lot for sure. At any rate, this finding that we are directed by our subconscious is especially true when we have little information about something, or where we do not have high motivation to pay attention. So this is exactly how a lot of us approach politics. So we're even more likely to use subconscious thinking when we're thinking about political issues. Finally, as we saw above, heuristics can strongly influence our thoughts and behaviors. They can even do so subconsciously. That is, there's a lot of evidence that our stereotypes, be they about members of a political party or an age group or a religion or a race, can prime us to think in different ways without our awareness. Thus, the role of heuristics becomes even more problematic. A related problem is our tendency to rationalize instead of being rational. To be rational means to take a detached look at all options, weigh them equally with all the evidence available, and then come to the decision. The evidence that we do that is very thin. We might with the biggest decisions in life that we are paying lots of attention to and we're really highly motivated to think through very carefully, but with a lot of political decisions we are much more likely to rationalize. When we rationalize, we begin with a prediction or a preference for one thing and then try to rationalize why it's the best preference to have, why it's the most factually accurate preference to have. It's not an equal weighing of all options. Instead, it's a process of getting all of the information that supports our own predilections. So this view of the public as comprised of rationalizing voters is an emerging received wisdom within political psychology, and you can see this is a new book just out this year by Milton Lodge and Charles Tabor, who are two of the most influential researchers in all of political psychology. And they have a whole book, and it's just filled with a lot of different experiments showing all of the different ways that we bring our own predilections to the table and rationalize them. So what is underpinning our tendency to rationalize is actually a very common finding in psychology, and that is the confirmation bias. This bias is that we are much more likely to accept information when it is in line with what we already think. Thus, if you are inclined to believe that climate change is caused by human activity, you will be much less fair to information that demonstrates this is unlikely and much more accepting of evidence that is in line with your own stance on climate change. In a very real way, our minds filter out a lot of unpleasant information for us. This is even more true as we become more invested in a topic and become emotionally involved. The more emotionally involved we are, the greater confirmation bias we can expect. This means that those who really care a lot about politics and spend lots of time thinking about and learning about politics might actually be more biased, which is a pretty surprising and scary possibility. It's actually also something that Converse found in his study. He found that the vast majority of participants taking these surveys, they had as if random responses, but there was a small portion, about 2 or 4% of the population that he sampled, that was highly ideological. So this finding helps us explain attitude polarization. Now, attitude polarization is when people can hardly talk about the same issue because they see completely different sets of facts at work. You can think of attitude polarization on things like the abortion debate, for instance. So the fact that as we learn more about political issues, we tend to have the confirmation bias working. That is, we tend to discount information that doesn't agree with us already and accept very easily information that does agree with us. Helps explain how people can end up seeing the same things so very differently. And we will spend a lot more time with that in the next lecture. So another snag is the question of whether the people who are to rule in a democratic state are susceptible to being manipulated by their leaders. In other words, are we being played by politicians? There is reason to fear this, and especially in light of the work coming out of social influence. So this work talks about deference to authority, and it really was motivated by the fear of what happened during World War II. And it was motivated by the question of how so many people could support a leader like Hitler and all of the atrocities that he committed. A series of experiments in psychology revealed the surprising finding that people will actually do things that they think are wrong pretty quickly when they think that an authoritative figure tells them to do so. Pictured here is one of the most famous studies, the Milgram experiments back in the 60s. Here, volunteers were told that they were taking part in a study on learning and motivation. They would read pairs of words to another volunteer, and that volunteer would have to read those words back. When the other person got it wrong, they would get a little electric shock. But that electric shock got stronger every time they got something wrong. So the guy getting shocked wasn't actually a volunteer in the research. He was actually in cahoots with the experimenters and was just faking it. Still, the actual volunteer administering the shock didn't know that. As the guy getting shocked purposefully stopped getting things correctly and got seemingly stronger and stronger shocks, the volunteer giving the shocks typically got pretty anxious and started to protest to the experimenters that the guy seemed like he'd had enough and that they should stop. The experimenters simply responded with vague, standardized prompts like, "The experiment requires that you continue." The vast majority of participants ended up carrying out the entire experiment, doing as they were told and administering the shock, though the actor started to pretend like he was in real physical anguish. It is in this way that we see ordinary people will often defer to authority, doing what they think is wrong if they feel it's required of them. This is actually the same theme of a new movie about one of the last century's greatest minds, Hannah Arendt. She was a Jew who fled Germany as a child at the beginning of Hitler's rule. She then became a well-known philosopher and political theorist in New York City. Eventually, she went to Jerusalem to cover the trials of a Nazi war criminal, Eichmann. What she reported made a lot of people furious, especially Jewish people. She argued that Eichmann, who was taking part in unbelievably evil acts, was not himself evil. He was instead just a normal paper-pushing bureaucrat following orders. His job was to get the trains running on time. It just happened to be the case that those trains were taking a lot of Jewish people to their deaths. This is what she meant when she famously called evil banal, which means that it is everyday and unremarkable. The point here is that it is rarely the case that an evil mastermind is what we have to fear. It is instead the blind conformity to authority and social norms that is within all of us. So that's pretty depressing stuff, and it brings up a scary possibility that politicians could manipulate our tendency to defer to authority to take advantage of us. This should remind you of instrumentalism, or the theory that political elites work to use political identities to their own gain by getting people fired up against someone else in order to gain more power. This has long been a concern with democratic theorists, that tyrants would be the ones to get power through lying to the public, playing upon their baser emotions and biases. This is something else that was foreshadowed by Plato, who worried that the only people who would get power in a democracy would be the power-hungry, who would do and say anything to get that power. That's why he had to have the philosopher kings who didn't want power. The only people who could exercise power for Plato was the person who did not want it. For us, the point, though, is that without critically analyzing everything said by politicians and how this lines up to the facts of the political world, we have a hard time knowing if we're being manipulated and misled. A closely related concern is the fear of mob rule, or the tyranny of the majority. The fear is that whether because of general ignorance, a lack of concern, anti-minority sentiment, or actually being manipulated by Machiavellian tyrants, a majority would support candidates and policies that are harmful, either to a minority or maybe even to the state as a whole, the majority itself. The U.S. founders were very aware of this, and they designed the American Constitution to have many checks on the public. So the Senate, for example, was such a check. It wasn't until 1913 that all states had popular election of the senators. Those had actually been elected by state governments. There's a separation of powers and checks and balances and a Supreme Court. So as we've seen, the US and other presidential democracies are somewhat less susceptible to this threat because they include separations of powers and checks and balances. So it's very unlikely that one tyrant can get too much done, at least not as quickly as he could in a parliamentary system where he would command both the executive and legislative branches. All right, so on our next lecture, we will consider the question, why can't we all just get along? Well, we won't actually consider that question, as disagreement is an important part of the democratic process. Instead, what we're really looking at is whether we can agree to disagree and see the opposing viewpoint. So until then, thank you for your attention.